Principal MacArthur, is it true that you use school funds to pay for a private vacation to the Bahamas? The lawyer's voice rang through the silent courtroom, the words cutting through the air like a knife. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the wealthy and respected Principal Theodore MacArthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man who had been untouchable for years now stared at the father sitting across the room, a single dad who had refused to be silenced. Yes or no? The lawyer pressed. MacArthur glanced at the judge, his polished demeanor slipping for the first time. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, simply raised her eyebrows and motioned for him to answer. Yes, MacArthur mumbled, barely audible. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously while parents exchanged shocked glances. It wasn't just the vacation. Evidence of other misdeeds had surfaced, painting a damning picture of fraud, corruption, and favoritism. At the center of it all was Brian Matthews, a widowed father of two who had brought the case against MacArthur after being pushed too far. But this wasn't just about money. It was personal. Brian wasn't here only to expose corruption. He was here to fight for his son. The judge banged her gavel, restoring order to the courtroom, but the damage was done. Everyone knew this case was bigger than anyone had anticipated. MacArthur's carefully curated life was unraveling, and Brian was just getting started. Brian Matthews' life had never been easy, but he never let it break him. After losing his wife to cancer 3 years ago, he devoted himself entirely to raising his 2 boys, Jacob and Ethan. They lived in a modest house on the edge of town, and while money was always tight, Brian made sure his kids had what they needed. Jacob, his eldest, had always been a bright, curious boy with a love for science. When Jacob was accepted into Westbrook Academy, the town's prestigious private school, Brian worked overtime shifts at the factory to cover the tuition. He saw it as a chance for Jacob to reach his full potential. At first, things seemed fine. Jacob made new friends and thrived in his classes. But within a few months, Brian noticed a change. Jacob became withdrawn and started complaining about how he felt out of place. At first, Brian chalked it up to nerves or typical middle school struggles. Then, the emails started. They came from the school's administration, demanding extra fees for class materials and mandatory trips that weren't part of the original tuition agreement. Brian had no choice but to pay, even when the costs seemed absurd. But when a $2,000 charge for a community-building retreat arrived, he couldn't keep quiet anymore. Brian scheduled a meeting with Principal MacArthur. He'd heard MacArthur was an intimidating man, but he was determined to get answers. The meeting didn't go as planned. MacArthur greeted Brian with a cold, patronizing smile. "Mr. Matthews, I assure you, these fees are necessary for the enrichment of all students." Brian tried to explain that he simply couldn't afford the latest charge. "I've already paid more than I was told. Isn't there any way to make adjustments for families like mine?" MacArthur's smile disappeared. "If you can't meet the financial expectations of Westbrook Academy, perhaps your son isn't a good fit for our school." The words hit Brian like a slap. He left the office feeling humiliated, but more determined than ever. Something wasn't right about the way the school operated, and he was going to find out what. Brian began digging into Westbrook Academy's finances, starting with the annual reports available to parents. He wasn't an accountant, but certain numbers didn't add up. Trips that were supposedly mandatory appeared to benefit only a select group of students. Donations from wealthy parents mysteriously coincided with promotions for staff members. Then he stumbled across an anonymous blog post. It accused MacArthur of using school funds for personal expenses, including luxury vacations. At first, Brian dismissed it as a bitter parent venting online. But the more he looked into it, the more the pieces fit. Brian reached out to the blogger, who turned out to be a former staff member. She confirmed his suspicions and provided documents that showed blatant misuse of school funds. Armed with this information, Brian contacted a lawyer. Back in the courtroom, MacArthur's lawyer tried to paint Brian as a desperate man looking for someone to blame. They pointed out his financial struggles and suggested he was simply bitter that he couldn't afford the school's fees. But Brian's lawyer dismantled their arguments with hard evidence. One by one, witnesses came forward to corroborate Brian's claims. A janitor testified that MacArthur had ordered expensive renovations to his personal office using school money. A former teacher described how funds meant for scholarships were diverted to pay for lavish events. The most damning testimony came from the school's accountant, who admitted under oath that MacArthur had falsified financial records. As the chapter of events unfolded in court, Brian thought about Jacob and Ethan. This wasn't just about holding MacArthur accountable. It was about standing up for every family who had been wronged. The judge leaned forward, addressing MacArthur. Principal MacArthur, this court finds sufficient evidence to move forward with criminal charges. Your actions have betrayed the trust of this community. MacArthur's face turned pale. Brian sat silently, his heart pounding. He'd won the first battle, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Just as the courtroom began to settle, MacArthur's lawyer stood up, a smug expression on his face. Your Honor, he said, we'd like to introduce new evidence that will change everything. The room froze. Brian's lawyer exchanged a wary glance with him. What evidence? The judge demanded. It concerns Mr. Matthews' personal history. This man isn't as innocent as he seems. Brian's stomach dropped. The courtroom was silent. Everyone held their breath as MacArthur's lawyer pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and laid it down on the table. The judge's gavel struck the bench, signaling that she expected answers. What is this? She asked, her voice sharp with authority. Brian's heart raced. The calm certainty he had felt just moments ago now felt fragile, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. MacArthur's lawyer opened the folder and began speaking. Your Honor, we have here a series of documents that suggest Mr. Matthews has a criminal background. We believe this information casts doubt on his credibility as a plaintiff in this case. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Brian's throat went dry. He tried to stay composed, but a sense of dread filled his chest. What were they saying? A criminal background? He didn't have a criminal record, did he? The judge leaned forward. What exactly are you implying, counselor? MacArthur's lawyer flipped through the pages of the folder, pulling out one document after another. These are court records. It seems that Mr. Matthews was involved in a financial dispute several years ago, one that led to a charge of embezzlement. Brian felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. His mind raced to recall anything that could explain what was being said. Embezzlement? He had never been convicted of anything remotely close to that. No, he whispered under his breath, shaking his head. That's not me. The lawyer continued, his voice louder now. It appears that Mr. Matthews was involved in a scheme to misappropriate funds while working at a different school district. The charges were later dropped, but the fact remains, he was under investigation. The courtroom was in an uproar. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Brian's lawyer stood quickly, trying to object, but MacArthur's lawyer held up another page. This was not the only incident. We have evidence that Mr. Matthews was sued for breach of contract in a business deal involving his previous employer. The case was settled out of court. Brian's mind spun. How could this be happening? He had never been charged with embezzlement and the business deal. He remembered that. It was a failed startup he had tried to run before Jacob was born, one that had fallen apart due to poor management, but it was nothing like what they were making it out to be. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't even shady. He had simply been an inexperienced entrepreneur trying to make a better life for his family. Yet, here they were, using his past mistakes to undermine everything he was fighting for. Your Honor, Brian's lawyer said, his voice strained. These records have no relevance to the current case. They are unrelated to the matter at hand and are being used solely to discredit my client. The judge didn't respond right away. She stared at the papers, her face unreadable. Brian could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze on him, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Well, Mr. Matthews, the judge finally asked, her voice softer but still firm. Would you like to explain these documents to the court? Brian stood up, his legs shaky, his mind racing to put together a defense. He had to clear his name, not just for himself, but for Jacob, for Ethan, for everyone who believed in him. I don't know how these documents got here, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Yes, I made mistakes in my past, but I've never committed a crime. That's not who I am. The case they're talking about, it was a misunderstanding. I was trying to start a business to take care of my family. I made poor decisions, But it wasn't a crime. The charges were dropped, and the other case was settled fairly. It's in the past. There was a long pause as the judge considered his words. The air in the room felt thick, as if everyone were waiting for the final verdict. I understand, the judge said slowly, but this new information does cast a shadow on your character. It will certainly be taken into consideration. Brian's stomach twisted. How could this happen? How had MacArthur's team found out about this? His thoughts were interrupted by the loud ringing of the courtroom phone. The bailiff answered it quickly, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, there's an urgent call for you. The judge nodded and motioned for the bailiff to hand her the phone. As she spoke quietly into the receiver, Brian's lawyer leaned toward him. This is bad, he muttered. They're trying to turn the tables on us. Brian nodded grimly. He knew that MacArthur wasn't going to go down without a fight. But just as he was beginning to lose hope, the judge suddenly turned back toward the room, her face pale. Mr. Matthews, she said, her voice cold. I've just been informed of another matter regarding Westbrook Academy. I'm afraid it requires immediate attention. Brian's blood ran cold. What now? Court is adjourned for the day, the judge continued. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I strongly suggest both parties review all evidence thoroughly before proceeding. The gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied quickly. Brian was still reeling from the allegations, but his lawyer was already by his side, pulling him away from the crowd. That was a close one, Brian's lawyer said, his face grim. You handled yourself well, but MacArthur's team is pulling out all the stops. They must have a mole on the inside. Brian didn't respond. He was still trying to process what had just happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. This wasn't just about money or corruption anymore. It was personal. Someone wanted him to fail. As they left the courthouse, Brian's phone buzzed. He checked the message. It was from an anonymous number. You're getting too close to the truth. Back off while you still can. His heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who sent the message, but the words chilled him to the bone. Brian stared at the message on his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it up to the light. The text was short, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. You're getting too close to the truth. Back off while you still can. His lawyer, Daniel, stood next to him, his eyes scanning the message with growing concern. This could be a warning, he said, his voice low. Someone's clearly watching you. Brian felt his stomach twist. He hadn't expected things to escalate like this. First, it was the allegations in court. Now, it seemed someone was actively trying to intimidate him into backing down. But there was no turning back now. He had already crossed the line. I'm not backing down, Brian said firmly, shaking his head. Whatever they're trying to hide, I'm going to find it. Daniel nodded, but there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. Just be careful, Brian. We don't know who's behind this, or how far they're willing to go. They reached the parking lot outside the courthouse, where Brian's beat-up car was parked. He unlocked it and slid into the driver's seat, his mind racing. Who could have sent the message? Was it someone from the school, or was it someone else connected to MacArthur? The possibilities seemed endless. Do you have any leads on the mole inside? Brian asked, trying to push the unsettling feeling in his chest aside. Daniel shook his head. Not yet, but we'll keep digging. It's clear MacArthur is pulling strings behind the scenes. We just need to be careful how we proceed. Brian started the engine, the rumble of the car filling the quiet space around them. He didn't feel like he was in control anymore. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into a web of lies and corruption. The truth he was fighting for wasn't just about exposing MacArthur. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he could feel it. As they drove through the streets of the city, Brian's mind kept going back to Jacob and Ethan. They were the reason he had to keep going. They had been through enough already, losing their mother. The last thing he wanted was for them to lose their father too, not because of something as trivial as money or power. They pulled up to Brian's house, a modest two-story building in a quiet neighborhood. He parked the car and got out, his thoughts still heavy. Daniel followed him up the front steps, but Brian stopped at the door, turning to face him. I'm going to need to get to MacArthur's office, Brian said quietly, his jaw clenched. If there's something hidden there, I need to find it. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're planning on breaking into his office? Brian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I don't see any other way. If I can find the real evidence, something concrete, I can take it to the authorities and blow this whole thing wide open. You're not doing this alone, Daniel said, his tone more serious now. We'll figure it out together. But we need to be smart about this. If MacArthur catches wind of what you're planning, he'll have the entire law on you. Brian nodded, though a part of him felt unsure. His life had never been normal, but now it felt like he was on the edge of something much darker than he could have imagined. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to protect his family from forces that were beyond his control. As they walked into the house, Brian's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Hello? He answered, his voice guarded. Mr. Matthews, a smooth voice on the other end said, I believe you're getting too deep into something that doesn't concern you. Brian's heart skipped a beat. Who is this? The voice chuckled, a sound that made Brian's skin crawl. Let's just say I have a vested interest in your little crusade. You wouldn't want to make things more difficult for yourself or your children, would you? Brian's pulse raced. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Whoever this was, they had been following him. The fact that they knew about his kids, his vulnerable, innocent kids, sent a chill through his veins. What do you want? Brian demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. I want you to stop digging. I want you to walk away from this. If you don't, there will be consequences. The kind you can't undo. The line went dead. Brian stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Was this someone connected to MacArthur, or was it a new player in the game? Brian? Daniel asked, stepping forward. That was a threat, Brian said, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. They know about Jacob and Ethan. This is serious. Daniel's face hardened. We'll need to take precautions. They've clearly made it personal now. But Brian wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts were spinning. Whoever was behind this was willing to go to any lengths to stop him. But it didn't matter. He was too far in. And if there was one thing Brian Matthews knew for sure, it was that he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. That night, as Brian sat at his kitchen table, his mind wouldn't stop racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept the lights off, hoping that the shadows would shield him from whatever dangers lurked in the dark. Just as he was about to head to bed, there was a knock on the door. A loud, insistent knock that made his heart skip a beat. He hesitated for a moment before walking toward the door. His hand rested on the knob, and for a second, he almost didn't want to open it. What if it was someone connected to MacArthur? What if it was another threat? But he had to know. He opened the door slowly, his pulse pounding in his ears. Standing on the porch was a woman he didn't recognize, tall, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun, dressed in a plain black coat. Mr. Matthews, she said in a quiet voice, I know you're looking for answers. I think I have some information that could help you. Brian's stomach dropped. He didn't know if he could trust her, but something about her tone told him she wasn't here to threaten him. Who are you? He asked cautiously. My name is Sarah, she replied, and I've been following the case closely. I know what MacArthur is hiding. I have proof. Brian's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. I need you to listen carefully, Sarah continued, because this is bigger than you think. Much bigger. Brian's mind raced. Proof. The word echoed in his head as he stepped aside, motioning for Sarah to come inside. She hesitated for a brief moment, then entered quickly, looking around nervously as if expecting someone to follow her. Sit down, Brian said, his voice low and urgent. Tell me everything. Sarah glanced toward the window, as though making sure no one was watching, before sitting down across from him. She placed a small envelope on the table. Her hands were shaking slightly, betraying her calm facade. I know you're in danger, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But I've been tracking MacArthur for months now. He's not just a principal. He's the head of a much larger network. He's involved in something illegal. It's all connected. Brian's heart skipped. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. Illegal? What are you talking about? She looked over her shoulder again before continuing. MacArthur has been using his position to funnel money from the school's budget into private investments. But that's not all. He's also been laundering money through a charity that he controls. It's a scheme that's been going on for years. And the worst part? He's not working alone. He's got people on the inside. People who are willing to do anything to keep this hidden. Brian's breath caught. He had suspected corruption at the school. But this was bigger than he could have ever imagined. And what does this have to do with me? Brian asked, his voice trembling. Sarah's eyes locked with his, her gaze intense. You're in the middle of something that could bring down not only MacArthur but also his entire operation. The lawsuit you filed against him? That's just the surface. The real truth lies deeper. MacArthur is afraid of what you might uncover. Brian's pulse quickened. This was no longer just about a corrupt principal. This was about an entire criminal network. And they were willing to stop at nothing to protect themselves. What do you mean, afraid? Brian asked. What are they planning to do? Sarah swallowed hard. They've been monitoring you, watching your every move. They know about your kids. They know you're close to exposing them. And now they're making their move to silence you. The room seemed to grow colder. The hair on the back of Brian's neck stood up. Every instinct in his body told him to be cautious, but his determination to protect his family, to expose the truth, overpowered his fear. Why are you telling me this? Brian asked. Why now? Sarah took a deep breath. Because I've seen what they're capable of. I've witnessed their intimidation tactics firsthand. But I also know that if you walk away now, they win. They get away with everything. And I can't let that happen. I've been collecting evidence of their illegal activities. Everything they've done to cover their tracks. And I'm ready to help you take them down. Brian's mind spun. This was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. But it came with a heavy price. If they were already watching him, and his family, it wouldn't be long before they made their move. What kind of evidence do you have? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah slid the envelope across the table. Everything you need is in there. Bank records, transaction logs, even testimonies from some of the people he's bribed. It's all proof of the laundering operation. It'll be enough to bring him down. Brian opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling as he pulled out the documents. His eyes skimmed the first few pages, and his stomach sank. The evidence was damning. There were detailed records of financial transactions, names, and dates. It was clear that MacArthur had been siphoning money from the school's budget, large amounts that were funneled into offshore accounts linked to a charity with his name on it. This is huge, Brian murmured, his mind racing. If I turn this over to the authorities, MacArthur will be finished. Sarah nodded. That's the plan. But you need to act fast. MacArthur won't sit idly by while you expose him. The moment he realizes you have this evidence, he'll make sure you disappear. And he won't stop until you do. Brian's heart hammered in his chest. He knew Sarah was right. They had to act quickly. But there was a problem. The longer he waited, the more dangerous it became. You're sure about this? He asked, still unsure whether he could trust her completely. You're not working with MacArthur, are you? Sarah's face hardened. I've been trying to get this information out for months. He's dangerous, but I won't let him win. Not after everything he's done. Brian studied her for a moment. She seemed genuine. But in this world of deception and lies, it was hard to know who to trust. Still, he had little choice. I'll do it, he said finally, his voice firm. I'll take this to the police. But I need to make sure my family is safe first. Sarah nodded. I understand. We'll need to lay low for a while. I suggest you don't contact anyone who could be compromised, not even your lawyer. We have to be careful who we trust. Brian stood up, pacing the room. His mind raced. How could he protect his family? How could he bring MacArthur down without risking everything? As he turned towards Sarah, ready to ask his next question, a loud crash sounded from outside. His head snapped toward the window, and his heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Get down, Sarah whispered urgently, pulling him away from the window. They're here. Before Brian could react, there was a pounding on the front door. A loud, frantic knock that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Open up, Mr. Matthews, a voice shouted from the other side. It was deep, authoritative, but also menacing. Brian's heart raced as he realized who it was. It was the police. But why were they here? Sarah grabbed his arm. You have to get out of here now. The knock came again, louder this time. Brian's mind raced. This wasn't just a visit. This was a warning. He couldn't stay. Not with his children at home. Not with MacArthur's people closing in. He grabbed the envelope of evidence from the table, his fingers shaking as he stuffed it into his jacket. I need to go. Now. Without waiting for a response, Brian dashed toward the back door, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had no idea where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The door slammed open behind him, and he bolted into the night, his breath coming in quick gasps. As he disappeared into the shadows, he heard the front door crash open. It was too late to go back. He was in this now, all the way. Rian's legs were pumping furiously, the cold night air biting at his face as he sprinted down the alleyway. His mind raced. Why were they here? His thoughts were a chaotic mess as he darted between buildings, trying to put distance between himself and the house. The knock on the door, the menacing voice. It all felt like a trap, a calculated move to force him into the open. Whoever had sent the police wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were making their move. Sarah had vanished into the shadows as soon as Brian had bolted. He didn't know where she'd gone, but he had to assume she was trying to keep a low profile as well. He couldn't trust anyone right now, not even her, though he knew she had given him vital information. He checked his phone. No missed calls. No new messages. Nothing. But that didn't mean the danger had passed. In fact, it only meant that they were closing in, watching his every move. His breath came out in heavy bursts as he ran through the back streets, trying to think of somewhere safe to go. There was no way he could go back to the house. It was compromised now. He needed a place to hide, somewhere no one would think to look. He turned the corner and came face to face with a dead end. A narrow alleyway stretched out in front of him, but there was nowhere to hide. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Someone was following him. He didn't need to look to know that. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his instincts told him to keep moving. Brian ran toward a fire escape ladder on the side of a nearby building, praying it was still in working condition. He grabbed the cold metal bars, pulling himself up as quickly as he could. The footsteps behind him were getting closer, too close for comfort. He reached the rooftop and quickly ducked behind a ventilation unit, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He could hear the heavy footsteps on the ground below. Whoever was after him wasn't far behind. Peeking over the edge, he saw two figures moving cautiously down the alley. They were looking for him, but they hadn't spotted him yet. He cursed under his breath, wondering if they had tracked him here, or if they were just hoping to catch him in the open. From his vantage point, he could see the entire street. He needed to make a decision. Staying put could mean getting trapped, but running blind would likely make him even more of a target. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. His finger hovered over the screen. Should he answer? What if it was another threat? Or worse, what if it was MacArthur's men? He swallowed hard and pressed the answer button. Hello? He said, his voice hoarse. Brian, came Sarah's voice, low and urgent. You're in grave danger. The police who showed up? They're not actually police. They're mercenaries working for MacArthur. You need to leave the city now. Brian's blood ran cold. Mercenaries? This was worse than he had imagined. The stakes had just been raised. MacArthur was pulling out all the stops to silence him. Where are you? Brian asked, his eyes scanning the streets for movement. I'm safe for now, she replied. But you need to get out of the city. MacArthur won't stop until he finds you. And if you don't leave now, they'll catch you. Brian clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to run. Not now. Not when he had the evidence. But he couldn't stay here, either. They had to make their next move. I need to get to the police station, he said, his voice tight. I've got everything to bring MacArthur down. I can't run anymore. I need to finish this. No, Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. You can't go there. They'll be expecting you. There's a safe house. One of MacArthur's former allies is working with me. I can get you there, but you have to trust me. Brian's mind reeled. He had to trust her? He wasn't sure he could, but he didn't have much of a choice. If he stayed, he risked everything. If he went with Sarah's plan, it might be his only chance to survive. "I'll go," he said, finally. "But you better be sure about this. If this is a trap—" "I swear, it's not," she interrupted. "I'll send you the details. Just get to the corner of 5th and Willow. You'll have company there to help you. Trust me, Brian." Before he could respond, she hung up. Brian took a deep breath. The footsteps had stopped. The figures in the alley were still searching, but they hadn't found him yet. He had a small window to act, but time was running out. With one last glance at the street below, he began to climb down the fire escape, his body tense, ready for anything. The dark alley was now his path to survival. He needed to get to the meeting point, and he needed to do it fast. As he hit the ground, he heard a car engine in the distance. It was getting louder. Someone was coming. The mercenaries were closing in. Brian broke into a sprint, running faster than he ever had before. He turned a corner and saw the intersection ahead. A few steps away. Almost there. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness. A car came speeding toward him, and for a moment, he thought it was one of MacArthur's men. But the car swerved to the side, screeching to a halt beside him. The door swung open, and a woman's voice called out, "Get in. Now." Without thinking, Brian dove into the car, slamming the door shut behind him. The car sped off before he could even catch his breath. "What the hell's going on?" he demanded, his heart still racing. "MacArthur's men are everywhere," the woman said, her hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. "I'm taking you to the safe house. No questions, just stay quiet." Brian didn't have time to argue. The car made several sharp turns, heading deeper into the city. He could barely make out where they were going in the dark, but he didn't care. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. Sarah's warning, the mercenaries, the evidence. Everything was spiraling out of control. As the car pulled into an industrial area, the woman slowed down, her eyes scanning the road ahead. She pulled into a narrow side street and parked behind a large warehouse, out of sight. "We're here," she said quietly, looking over at him. "Stay close." Brian nodded, his pulse still pounding. He stepped out of the car, glancing around nervously. There was no sign of anyone following, but he knew that could change in an instant. The woman led him toward the back of the warehouse, stopping in front of a hidden door. She knocked twice, rapidly, and waited. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway beyond. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The woman ushered him in quickly, and as the door shut behind them, Brian felt a strange sense of unease settle in his chest. "Who else is in here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just us for now," she replied. "But stay alert. MacArthur won't stop until he's found you." Brian nodded. He had no idea who this woman was or how much she really knew about MacArthur's operation, but for now, she was his only ally. The truth was getting closer. But with every step he took toward it, the danger was growing, intensifying, and there was no turning back. The warehouse was eerily quiet. The dimly lit hallway stretched ahead of Brian like a tunnel, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, shifting shadows on the concrete walls. His heart was still pounding, and every creak and groan of the old building made him flinch. The woman leading him turned suddenly, her sharp profile illuminated by the dim light. "Stay close," she said in a hushed voice. "This place isn't as secure as it looks. We don't have much time." Brian's grip tightened on the envelope in his jacket. The evidence was everything. If he lost it now, everything he'd fought for, the threats, the danger, the pain, would be for nothing. He followed her deeper into the building, his eyes darting to every shadow, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. "Where's Sarah?" he asked finally, his voice low but firm. "She said she'd meet me." "She'll be here," the woman replied. "She's securing the next location. This one's just a stopgap. We couldn't risk taking you straight to the safe house." Brian wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more on edge. He had no way of knowing if she was telling the truth, and trust was a scarce resource in his world now. They reached a small room at the back of the warehouse, where a makeshift table and a few folding chairs were set up. A single laptop sat on the table, its screen glowing faintly. The woman gestured for Brian to sit, then closed the door behind them. "What's your name?" Brian asked, his voice a little sharper this time. "Call me Erica," she said, sitting across from him. "That's all you need to know for now." Brian clenched his jaw. He hated the secrecy, but he couldn't afford to push back too hard. He needed answers, and if Erica had them, he'd have to play along. "What's the plan?" he asked, leaning forward. "I have evidence that can take MacArthur down, but every second I sit here, he's out there trying to cover his tracks and come after me." Erica nodded, her expression grim. "I know, but we can't act impulsively. If we go to the authorities now, MacArthur's connections could bury the evidence before anyone even looks at it. You're not just up against him, Brian. He has people in the system, judges, officers, even politicians. They'll do whatever it takes to protect him." Brian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Erica leaned forward, lowering her voice. "We go public. If the media gets this, MacArthur can't hide. Once the story's out there, even his allies won't be able to help him. They'll be too busy trying to save their own skins." Brian hesitated. It made sense, but it was risky. Going public would mean putting himself and his family in even more danger. MacArthur wouldn't just fight back. He'd retaliate. Hard. As if sensing his hesitation, Erica added, "I know it's dangerous, but it's the only way. We have connections, journalists who aren't afraid to expose the truth. If we can get the evidence to them, they'll take it from there." Before Brian could respond, the door creaked open and Sarah stepped into the room. Her face was pale, her eyes scanning the room quickly before locking onto Brian. "They're closing in," she said without preamble. "We don't have time to wait." Erica frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah walked over to the laptop, opening it and typing quickly. "I intercepted a communication. MacArthur's men know about this warehouse. They're on their way." Brian shot to his feet, his pulse racing. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe an hour. Maybe less," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "We need to move." Erica stood, grabbing a backpack from the corner of the room and slinging it over her shoulder. "We'll take the back route. There's a car waiting a few blocks from here. It'll take us to the next safe house." Sarah glanced at Brian. "You still have the envelope?" Brian patted his jacket. "I'm not letting it out of my sight." "Good," Sarah said, "because if we lose that, we lose everything." The trio moved quickly through the darkened warehouse, their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. Brian's nerves were frayed, every shadow and sound feeling like a threat. They exited through a side door into an alleyway, the cool night air hitting Brian's face like a slap. Erica led the way, her movements confident and efficient. Sarah followed closely, her head on a swivel as she scanned the streets for danger. Brian brought up the rear, his eyes darting to every corner, his hand gripping the envelope in his jacket like a lifeline. They made it halfway down the alley before the sound of tires screeching to a halt shattered the silence. A black SUV skidded to a stop at the mouth of the alley, its headlights flooding the narrow space with blinding light. "Run!" Erica shouted, breaking into a sprint. Brian didn't need to be told twice. He bolted after her, his heart pounding as the SUV's doors flew open and several men in dark suits spilled out, guns drawn. "Don't stop!" Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The trio darted through the maze of alleyways, their pursuers close behind. The sound of boots pounding on the pavement and the occasional shout filled the air, but Brian didn't dare look back. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he pushed himself harder. They rounded a corner, and Erica skidded to a halt in front of a chain-link fence blocking the path. "Help me!" she shouted, gripping the fence and beginning to climb. Brian and Sarah followed, scrambling up the fence as fast as they could. Shots rang out behind them, the sound echoing through the alleyway. Brian felt his chest tighten as he reached the top, adrenaline surging through his veins. They dropped down on the other side and kept running, weaving through the dark streets until they reached a small parking lot. A silver sedan was parked at the far end, its engine idling. "Get in," Erica shouted, throwing open the driver's door and sliding behind the wheel. Brian and Sarah dove into the back seat, slamming the doors shut as Erica floored the gas pedal. The car sped out of the lot, tires screeching as they tore down the street. Brian glanced out the rear window, his breath catching as he saw the SUV in pursuit. "They're still on us," he shouted. Erica gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Hold on." The sedan veered onto a narrow side street, the tires skimming the curb as Erica pushed the car to its limits. The SUV was still gaining on them, its headlights growing brighter in the rearview mirror. "We can't outrun them," Sarah said, her voice tight. "We need a plan." "I've got one," Erica replied, her eyes narrowing. "But it's risky." Brian didn't have time to ask what she meant. The car suddenly swerved into an abandoned parking garage, the sound of the engine echoing off the concrete walls. Erica killed the headlights, plunging them into darkness. "Get ready," she said, her voice low. "This is about to get rough." The SUV roared into the garage behind them, its lights cutting through the dark like a predator hunting its prey. Brian gripped the edge of his seat, his heart pounding as the chase entered its final, desperate stage. The dark parking garage became a labyrinth of concrete and shadows, the air thick with tension. Erica maneuvered the sedan through the maze of ramps and pillars, her movements precise but frantic. The SUV's headlights loomed behind them, casting long, ominous shadows that danced across the walls. "Hold on tight," Erica muttered, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Brian could barely breathe, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Every sharp turn threw him against the door, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands. Beside him, Sarah was scanning their surroundings, her eyes darting from corner to corner. "They're gaining," Sarah shouted, glancing out the rear window. Erica gritted her teeth and slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The SUV, caught off guard, swerved to avoid a collision, slamming into a concrete pillar with a deafening crash. "Go," Brian yelled, adrenaline surging through his veins. Erica floored the gas, the tires squealing as they sped toward the exit. But as they rounded the next corner, another SUV appeared, blocking their path. Its high beams flooded the garage, blinding them. "Reverse," Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The second SUV's doors flew open, and armed men poured out, their weapons trained on the sedan. Erica slammed the brakes again, her face pale but focused. "This is it," she said through gritted teeth. "We're trapped." Brian's mind raced. No, not now. Not like this. He clutched the envelope tighter, knowing that if they lost it, everything would be over. The men surrounded the car, shouting orders. "Out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." Erica raised her hands, her expression unreadable. "We have to comply," she said softly. Brian hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. Sarah and Erica did the same, their faces tense. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His gun was aimed squarely at Brian. "Where's the envelope?" the man demanded, his voice cold and sharp. Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was a blur of fear and defiance. "I won't ask again," the man growled, stepping closer. "Hand it over." Before Brian could respond, Sarah moved. In a flash, she lunged at the man, her movements quick and calculated. She grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply, and the gun fell to the ground with a clatter. "Run!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing through the garage. Chaos erupted. Erica shoved one of the men aside and grabbed Brian's arm, pulling him toward a nearby stairwell. The envelope was still in his hands, and he clutched it like his life depended on it. Gunfire rang out behind them, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Brian didn't look back. He couldn't. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They burst into the stairwell, their footsteps echoing as they climbed. Erica led the way, her movements swift and determined. Brian followed, his legs burning with every step. "Keep moving," Erica shouted, glancing over her shoulder. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. The men were in pursuit, their voices shouting orders to one another. They reached the roof, the cold night air hitting Brian's face like a slap. The city stretched out before them, the distant sounds of traffic and sirens mixing with the pounding of his heart. "There's no way down," Brian said, his voice filled with panic. Erica scanned the rooftop, her eyes narrowing. "We're not done yet," she said, her tone fierce. She ran to the edge, looking down at the alley below. A fire escape clung to the side of the building, its rusted metal barely visible in the darkness. "This way," Erica called, motioning for Brian to follow. They climbed onto the fire escape, the metal creaking under their weight. The descent was treacherous, every step feeling like it could give way at any moment. The men burst onto the roof just as Brian and Erica reached the second level of the fire escape. Shouts filled the air, followed by more gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the metal railings, the sound sharp and terrifying. "Hurry," Erica urged, her voice tense. Brian moved as fast as he could, his hands gripping the cold metal railings. He could feel the men closing in, their footsteps pounding above him. They reached the ground and sprinted into the alley, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of gunfire faded as they weaved through the darkened streets, their pursuers falling behind. Finally, they ducked into a narrow passageway between two buildings, collapsing against the walls. Brian's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, the envelope still clutched tightly in his hands. "Where's Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Erica shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know. She stayed behind to buy us time." Brian's stomach twisted. He didn't know if Sarah had made it out, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. They were still in danger, and the envelope was still in his possession. "What do we do now?" Brian asked, his voice trembling. Erica looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "We keep moving. We can't stop until this is over." But as they prepared to leave the alley, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the scarred man, his gun aimed directly at Brian's chest. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold and final. Brian froze, his breath catching in his throat. The scarred man's gun was steady, his cold eyes locked onto Brian like a predator cornering its prey. Erica stepped in front of him, her hands raised defensively, trying to shield Brian and the envelope. "Let's not do anything stupid," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You don't want to pull that trigger." "Not here." The man smirked, his scar stretching into a twisted grimace. "Oh, I think I do. You've caused enough trouble for MacArthur, and it's time to put an end to it." Brian's mind raced. He had to think fast, but fear clouded his thoughts. If he handed over the envelope, everything he'd fought for would be lost. But if he didn't, before he could decide, a sound echoed through the alley, footsteps approaching from behind. For a split second, everyone turned toward the noise, their attention shifting. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, and she was clutching her side as if she'd been injured, but her eyes were fierce. She held a broken piece of pipe in her hand, and without hesitation, she swung it at the scarred man's arm. The impact sent his gun flying out of his hand, clattering to the ground. "Run," Sarah shouted, doubling over in pain but still motioning for Brian and Erica to move. Brian didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Erica's arm and bolted down the alley, Sarah limping behind them. The scarred man roared in frustration, scrambling to retrieve his gun. The trio turned a corner, their breaths ragged, their steps uneven. "Sarah," Brian shouted over his shoulder. "Are you okay?" "I'll be fine," she panted, her face contorted with pain. "Just keep moving." The alley opened up into a busy street, the glow of streetlights illuminating their frantic escape. Cars honked as they darted across the road, narrowly avoiding oncoming traffic. Brian could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his grip on the envelope tightening with every step. Erica led them into another alley, this one quieter and darker. They collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Sarah sank to the ground, clutching her side. Brian knelt beside her, his hands trembling. "You're hurt," he said, his voice laced with worry. "It's just a graze," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, pulling her hand away to reveal a shallow wound. "One of them got off a lucky shot before I made it to you. I'll live." Erica crouched down, her face grim. We can't stay here. He'll regroup, and he knows these streets better than we do. We need to get to the safe house. Do you even have a plan for getting us there? Brian asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Erica nodded. There's a subway station a few blocks from here. It'll be crowded enough to give us cover. Once we're underground, we'll head to a secondary exit near the safe house. Brian glanced at Sarah, who was struggling to get to her feet. Can you make it? Sarah gave him a weak smile. I didn't come this far to quit now. The subway station was a chaotic blend of noise and movement. Commuters bustled past them, their faces indifferent as Brian, Erica, and Sarah weaved through the crowd. The envelope was tucked securely inside Brian's jacket, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. They boarded a train just as the doors were closing, finding a spot near the back. Brian kept his head down, scanning the car for any signs of danger. Sarah leaned against the wall, her breathing shallow but steady. Erica stood beside the door, her eyes sharp and alert. The train lurched forward, and for the first time in what felt like hours, there was a moment of stillness. Brian allowed himself to breathe, though his mind was far from calm. What's the plan when we get to the safe house? He asked Erica quietly. We'll regroup, she replied. There's a secure line there. We can contact the journalist I mentioned and arrange to hand over the evidence. Brian nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Every step forward seemed to lead to another trap, another danger. He wondered if they'd ever make it to the end of this nightmare. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and Brian's heart sank as the doors slid open. Two men stepped onto the train, both wearing dark suits, their eyes scanning the passengers. Brian tensed, his pulse quickening. They're here, he whispered. Erica followed his gaze, her jaw tightening. Stay calm, she said softly. Don't make a move until I say. The men moved through the car, their eyes darting from face to face. One of them paused, his gaze lingering on Brian for a moment too long. Brian looked away, trying to appear disinterested, but he could feel the man's eyes on him. The train began to move again, and the men continued their search. Erica leaned toward Brian, her voice barely audible. We get off at the next stop. Be ready to run. Brian nodded, his palms slick with sweat. The train slowed as it approached the station, and the tension in the car was palpable. The moment the doors opened, Erica grabbed Brian's arm, pulling him out into the crowd. The men reacted instantly, shouting and pushing through the throng of commuters. Brian's heart pounded as they sprinted through the station, weaving between startled passengers. They burst out onto the street, the cold air hitting them like a wall. The safe house wasn't far now, but the men were gaining on them. Brian glanced over his shoulder, his stomach sinking as he saw the scarred man emerging from the subway entrance, his gun drawn. Keep going, Erica yelled, leading them down a narrow side street. The safe house came into view, a nondescript building with boarded-up windows and a heavy metal door. Erica pounded on the door, her fist flying as she shouted, It's us. Let us in. The door creaked open, and a man with a grizzled beard and a shotgun stepped out. Get inside, he barked. Brian and Sarah darted past him, Erica following close behind. The door slammed shut just as the scarred man appeared at the end of the street, his face twisted with rage. Inside, the safe house was sparse but secure. The man with the shotgun bolted the door, his sharp eyes assessing the group. You've got trouble on your heels, he said grimly. You don't say, Erica shot back, her voice laced with sarcasm. Brian leaned against the wall, his legs trembling as he tried to catch his breath. The envelope was still safe, but the danger wasn't over. We need to move fast, Erica said, turning to the bearded man. Get the line ready. We're contacting the journalist. The man nodded, disappearing into another room. Sarah sank onto a battered couch, wincing as she adjusted her injured side. We made it, Brian murmured, though his voice was hollow. But for how long? Erica looked at him, her expression unreadable. Long enough to finish what we started. But just as the tension began to ease, the sound of shattering glass filled the room. A flaming object crashed through one of the boarded windows, and the acrid smell of gasoline filled the air. They found us, Sarah said, her voice trembling. They're trying to burn us out. The fire spread quickly, the flames licking up the walls as thick black smoke began to fill the room. Brian's chest tightened, both from the fumes and the rising panic in the room. The bearded man grabbed a fire extinguisher from the corner, rushing to smother the flames, but the fire was spreading too fast. "We have to get out of here," Erica shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. Brian's mind raced as he clutched the envelope to his chest. The evidence. It couldn't be destroyed, not after everything they'd gone through to protect it. He scanned the room for an exit, his eyes stinging from the smoke. "The back door," the bearded man called out, pointing toward a narrow hallway. "It leads to the alley." Sarah struggled to her feet, leaning on Brian for support. Her face was pale, and the wound on her side was bleeding again, staining her shirt a dark red. "I can make it," she said through gritted teeth, though her body told a different story. Brian helped her toward the hallway as Erica and the bearded man worked to clear a path through the smoke. Flames crackled and roared around them, the heat unbearable. "Go," Erica yelled, shoving Brian and Sarah ahead. "I'll cover you." Brian didn't argue. He guided Sarah down the hallway, his heart pounding as the smoke grew thicker. The exit came into view, a heavy metal door with a glowing red exit sign above it. Relief flooded through him as he pushed it open, the cool night air rushing in. They stumbled into the alley, coughing and gasping for breath. Behind them, the fire raged, the flames visible through the broken windows of the safe house. Erica and the bearded man emerged moments later, both covered in soot. Erica's face was set in a grim expression as she scanned the alley for any signs of their pursuers. "They're still out there," she said, her voice low. "They're not going to stop until they have what they want." Brian leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he clutched the envelope. "We need to move. The evidence. We have to get it to the journalist." Erica nodded. "There's another safe house a few blocks from here. It's not ideal, but it'll have to do." The bearded man pulled out a phone, dialing quickly. "I'll alert the team. We need backup." They moved quickly through the darkened streets, sticking to the shadows and avoiding main roads. Brian kept his head down, his mind racing. The attack on the safe house had been a clear message. MacArthur's men weren't just trying to intimidate them, they were out for blood. Sarah limped beside him, her face pale but determined. "We're close," Erica said, leading them down a narrow alley that opened into a small courtyard. The second safe house was a modest brick building with boarded windows and a reinforced door. They entered cautiously, the bearded man checking the perimeter before bolting the door behind them. The room inside was sparse but functional, with a small table, a few chairs, and a stack of old filing cabinets in the corner. "This'll have to do for now," Erica said, setting her bag down. She turned to Brian. "We need to make the call." Brian nodded, pulling out the envelope. His hands were shaking as he placed it on the table, the weight of its importance settling over him. Erica retrieved a laptop from her bag, booting it up quickly. "Who are we contacting?" Brian asked. "A journalist named Mark Landry," Erica replied. "He's one of the best investigative reporters out there. If anyone can get this story out, it's him." The screen flickered to life, and Erica began typing furiously. "We're sending him a secure message," she explained. "Once he confirms, we'll arrange a drop-off for the evidence." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited for a response. Brian paced the room, his nerves fraying with every second. The weight of everything they'd been through was pressing down on him, and the thought of losing it all now was unbearable. Finally, the laptop chimed. Erica leaned forward, her eyes scanning the message. "He's in," she said, a hint of relief in her voice. "He wants us to meet him tonight. There's a diner on the east side of the city, public enough to keep us safe, but quiet enough to talk." Brian nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. "How do we know it's not a trap?" "We don't," Erica admitted. "But we don't have another choice." The diner was a retro-style building with neon lights that flickered in the darkness. Brian, Erica, and Sarah sat in a booth near the back, the envelope tucked securely under Brian's arm. The air was thick with tension, every passing moment feeling like an eternity. Mark Landry arrived right on time. He was a tall, lean man in his 40s, his sharp eyes taking in the room as he approached their table. He wore a simple black jacket and carried a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "You must be Brian," he said, extending a hand. His voice was calm, his demeanor professional. Brian shook his hand, his grip firm. "That's me. And this," he placed the envelope on the table. "This is what you've been waiting for." Landry opened the envelope carefully, his eyes widening as he skimmed the contents. "This is incredible," he murmured. "If this is all verified, it's enough to bury MacArthur and everyone connected to him." "It's all real," Erica said firmly. "We've risked everything to get it to you." Landry nodded, his expression serious. "I'll take it from here. But you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, things will escalate. MacArthur won't go down without a fight." "We know," Brian said, his voice steady. "But this needs to end. He's hurt too many people for too long." Landry stood, tucking the envelope into his satchel. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Stay safe." He left the diner quickly, disappearing into the night. For a moment, Brian allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The evidence was in good hands. The story would finally come out. But just as they were getting ready to leave, the windows of the diner shattered. Men in dark suits stormed in, guns drawn. "Get down," Erica shouted, flipping the table for cover. Chaos erupted. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Chaos exploded in the diner as shards of glass rained down and customers screamed, scrambling for cover. The men in suits advanced with precision, their weapons trained on Brian, Erica, and Sarah. The three ducked behind the overturned table, the sound of gunfire tearing through the air. "We're sitting ducks here," Erica shouted, peering over the edge of the table and firing a small pistol she'd pulled from her jacket. Brian's mind raced. The envelope was gone. Mark Landry had it. That meant the evidence was safe, but they weren't. If MacArthur's men were here, it was their last, desperate attempt to clean up loose ends. Sarah, clutching her injured side, grabbed Brian's arm. "We can't stay here. We have to move." Erica nodded. "Cover me. I'll clear the way to the kitchen." Brian reached for a heavy glass sugar dispenser on the table, his heart pounding. He hurled it at one of the men, hitting him squarely in the chest and knocking him off balance. Erica used the momentary distraction to dart toward the kitchen, firing as she went. Brian and Sarah followed close behind, dodging gunfire and overturned chairs. They burst into the kitchen, the smell of grease and old food mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The staff had already fled, leaving behind steaming pots and half-prepped meals. Erica slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with a chair wedged under the handle. "They won't hold back," she said breathlessly. "We need to get out of here before reinforcements show up." Brian scanned the room, his eyes landing on a narrow service entrance at the back. "There!" he shouted, pointing. The trio rushed toward the door, but it burst open before they could reach it. Two more men stepped in, blocking their escape. Erica didn't hesitate. She fired twice, dropping one of the men, but the other lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. Brian grabbed a frying pan from a nearby counter and swung it with all his strength. The heavy metal connected with the man's head, sending him sprawling to the floor. Erica scrambled to her feet, wiping blood from her lip. "Thanks," she muttered, grabbing Brian's arm. "Let's go." They pushed through the service entrance and into the alley behind the diner. The cold night air hit them like a slap, but there was no time to catch their breath. More SUVs roared down the street, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "We're not going to make it," Sarah gasped, her voice weak. "Yes, we are," Brian said, his jaw clenched. "We have to." The roar of engines grew louder, the SUVs closing in. But just as the vehicles screeched to a halt, another sound filled the air, the wail of police sirens. Dozens of squad cars swarmed the scene, their lights flashing red and blue. Officers poured out, their guns drawn. "Drop your weapons," a commanding voice boomed. MacArthur's men hesitated, their weapons still raised. Then, one by one, they began to lower their guns, realizing they were outnumbered. Brian, Erica, and Sarah stood frozen, unsure if they were finally safe. Through the chaos, Brian spotted a familiar figure stepping out of a squad car, Mark Landry. He was holding up the envelope, his face set in determination. "I turned it in," he said, walking toward them. "Everything. The evidence is now in the hands of the authorities." MacArthur's finished. Brian's legs gave out, and he sank to the ground, overwhelmed by relief. Sarah leaned against the wall, her breathing labored but steady. Erica stood tall, her eyes scanning the scene to make sure it wasn't a trick. Minutes later, another squad car pulled up, and a man in handcuffs was dragged out. It was MacArthur. His expensive suit was rumpled, and his face was a mask of fury and fear. He looked at Brian, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," MacArthur hissed as officers shoved him toward a waiting van. "You don't know who you're messing with." Brian stood, meeting MacArthur's gaze with steel in his eyes. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. And it's over for you." The officers loaded MacArthur into the van, and as the doors slammed shut, Brian felt a weight lift from his chest. The nightmare was finally ending. Days later, the story broke across every major news outlet. Mark Landry's exposé laid everything bare: MacArthur's embezzlement, his money laundering, and his network of corrupt officials. The public outcry was immediate, and arrests were made across the city. Brian sat at home with his sons, Jacob and Ethan, watching the news unfold. Jacob looked up at him, his eyes wide. "You did it, Dad," he said softly. "You stopped him." Brian smiled, pulling his son close. "We did it, kiddo. All of us." The evidence had done its job. The truth was out, and justice was being served. But Brian knew this wasn't just about exposing a corrupt man. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the story faded from the headlines, Brian returned to his quiet life, grateful for the chance to rebuild. He'd fought for his family, for the truth, and for the countless others who'd been wronged. And while the scars of the battle remained, they were a reminder of the strength it took to win. For the first time in years, Brian felt free.